Okay, section 3 then. So we're going to now focus on this topsy-turvy battle between the North and the South to deal with slavery. And this is quite a complicated era, and I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible. So we already had right at the beginning, there's a big difference between North and South. We have in the North, it's more capitalist, it's more urbanized. There's a mixed economy, meaning there's many different ways of earning money. South is much more semi-modern plantation, so it's largely farming based. So because of that, a lot of the plantations rely on slavery, and that's what's going to cause a major issue here. So what we see is 7 slaveholding states led by South Carolina eventually seceded. They removed themselves from the Union, and we get a civil war. At the end of the war, Lincoln states that actually this is all to do with slavery, but that's an oversimplification. We've got to get into our heads that slavery, though based in the South, very much affected the North as well. 3.2 million slaves by 1850, 1.3 billion was their worth, and it really is the economic glue which hangs together the North and the South, with northern businesses prospering and work provided for US citizens in the North on the back of the money made from slavery. There is, however, a clear moral move led in the North about attacking slavery. We got abolitionists growing in strength, and they'd grown in strength for a number of reasons. We got the National Anti-Slavery Society, 1833, with 250,000 members by 1838. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, gave lectures. He and Harriet Tubman assisted thousands to escape via the Underground Railroad. And then in 1851, got a very famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. 2 million copies sold in 10 years, really focusing on the horrors of slavery. Population grows in the North, and because population is linked to votes, the South's position was losing political power because of the focus on a state's power being governed by its size. 1846, as a result of this, the Congress said that slavery should be banned in the new territories which had recently been gained from Mexico, and that's gonna be a negative for the South. So if we draw a line in the middle here, and if we go upwards, that's a gain towards those who are opposed to slavery. At the moment, we've got a slight gain because we're saying that slavery is being banned in those anything gained from Mexico. Right, now the South tried to start fight back, and in 1850 we got the Henry Clay Compromise that Washington will be slave free and Utah will be allowed to decide themselves. Sorry, California and Washington should be free, but the new territories like New Mexico and Utah should be allowed to decide for themselves. That goes against the previous agreements. Meanwhile, they also managed to pass the idea that there would be a Fugitive Slave Act, which says that if slaves have been found, escaped slaves, even the North, then the North had a duty to return them. So we now have also a further, in 1854, the Missouri Compromise, remember, said that slavery wouldn't go any further south. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act went against this, allowing the 2 states of Kansas and Nebraska to choose if they wanted slavery by popular vote. Now that's a major decision. So we've got the previous one going further to the anti-slavery, and now we're having a move towards the pro-slavery because of this choice. Both sides throw their settlers into the area, trying to influence the vote, trying to make sure the vote goes their way. Massive, awful violence known as Bleeding Kansas, and the violence even continues into politics. It's a bit later on in this, but 1865, 2 Southern senators beat a Northern senator unconscious on the floor of the Senate over this issue. So over this issue of where slavery goes. So we got a fight back from the South. Realizing this, as a result, the party that's got control at the moment is the Democratic Party. Might go against what our current beliefs are, but that's the way it was. The Democratic Party supported agriculture. Many people will think it's going too far to support the Southern slaveholders. We now have the Republican Party set up. as a direct result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act to try to halt the power of these Southern slavers. And they get great support from abolitionists. We get a Democrat, James Buchanan, become president and openly supported the idea of slavery north of the Missouri Compromise. So at the same time, the Republicans Party is fighting, even further swayed by the Democrats. And he supports a controversial Supreme Court judgment saying that the Dred Scott decision, which said Congress had no right to ban slavery. So it's saying that states have got the power to keep slavery going. So if anything, we got the focus on the Southern, of those who wanted to maintain slavery. Now we have a change. So we now have a new presidential candidate, a Republican, Abraham Lincoln, who is a champion for hard-working Americans and wants to stop the power of the Southern slavers. Now we get the descent into the Civil War. So the state government of South Carolina voted 169 to 0 to secede. Then further 6 states join. Then we get the Confederacy led by slaveholder Jefferson Davis, saying that they were testing the powers of the president. Lincoln becomes president in 1861. He states that it's illegal for the South and that all foughts with the property. And then we get the first shots of the Civil War when the Confederacy opened fire and fought Sumter, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, and war has begun. So the president's restored the equilibrium, but that equilibrium is really now being tested. We got a level civil war. That's where we've got to. It's so tight, so even is the match between the two. Now, in the early stages, we have to remember that life continued as normal. So in the North, African Americans, though free, have lived in the worst areas with the worst jobs, with the worst money, and they're very much segregated. In the South, most Black Americans were slaves. They were cramped, lived in cramped cabins. There was disease. They couldn't read or write. That was illegal. And right at the beginning, slavery continues in the South and the slave states, including the slave states that decided to support the North. So that's Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and the western half of Virginia. So remember, there are some states who are slave states which are supporting the North. Now that's important because in the early years of the war, there's a rush of black volunteers to the Union Army, but Lincoln didn't change just because he didn't want to lose those border states. We get a little bit of the first fight back. In 1862, we get a law saying that captured slaves could be held legally as contraband as well. The South disputes that, but the North say, yep, we've beaten you, they're your property, we can take them as part of our taking of your property, and therefore it's allowed. In 1862, we get the Second Confiscation Act, which meaning slave holding land automatically becomes free. So the North's winning this war, and they're taking the land back. So in the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina, 10,000 slaves are freed and form a new town called Mitchellville. So we get at the moment the North winning the Civil War and taking land off the South. Right, phase 2, total war. So that was the first stage is Lincoln's quite conservative about these changes. On the 1st of January 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation says slaves will be freed at the end of the war. So that's the first time it's openly stated that. We get the first South Carolina volunteers formed from free slaves fighting in the South, and then in the North, a 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment fighting again in the North. 70% of Northern black men join the Union Army. However, to begin with, they're not treated equally whatsoever. They haven't got equal pay, and the ban on black officers continued. They had to actually go for disobedience to get equal pay. Women are taking part in the Civil War. Harriet Tubman, we mentioned her earlier, as a scout and a spy, and Susie King Taylor as a battlefield nurse and taught poor white soldiers to read and write. So as the war was being fought and being won by the North, they send out missionaries. They help freed men, previous slaves, to read and write. They also employ the freed slave to work as paid labourers. However, money's not very much, barely enough to feed and clothe them. And although they aren't allowed to be whipped, they aren't allowed to leave these plantations. So very little has really changed. Final few months of the war, however, General Sherman cut through Confederate forces And to win over the freed slaves, each one is promised 40 acres of land and a mule to be taken from the slaveholder property. They also agreed to rent small farms to freed slaves. Investigations during this time period show that of the 113,000 freemen in Mississippi and Arkansas, over half were entirely self-supporting. So there's a real positive here at the moment that these slaves will be able to look after themselves. However, in contrast to that, up in the north, already we've got problems. In New York City, poor white citizens being forced to join the war take out their anger on black citizens in the area. 4 days of violence where they drowned or lynched black citizens. Right, so the war is won by the North in 1865. 250,000 Americans lie dead. 18 out of every 100 Confederate soldiers don't return, as opposed to 6 out of 100 Union soldiers in the North. And now we get this Reconstruction. Now, things could have been very, very different. The 13th Amendment to ban slavery, and on the 4th of March 1865, Lincoln began his second term. However, who knows what would have happened if he'd have lived? But he's shot dead watching a play in Ford's Theatre by John Wilkes Booth, who said he did it to put a stop to nigger citizenship. So any chance that that Civil War was going to be used to bring forward a wholesale change, a positive change for freed slaves, now looks like it's, well, things will have to wait. And that's very much how it looks. Remember, they've just fought for years over this issue of slavery. President Andrew Johnson, the former vice president, seems to throw this all away. He says that Confederate states, those southern states, could immediately regain their power. They could re-establish their state governments. He gave the land back to slave owners, including those sea islands we looked at earlier, and only 2,000 of the black families held onto their land. And then, in December of that year, Reconstruction is declared finished. On top of that, although enslaving is banned, so we can't go back to slaving, we get these black codes limiting the rights of the black workers, stopping them from serving on juries. We get African Americans not allowed to rent or own their own farmland, and the Ku Klux Klan is formed. So if we draw this line again, and we say that during the Civil War, the 13th Amendment and the changes, the promises of Abraham Lincoln are given great promise, and we say that up to there, that now has been a long way brought back. They've been a slight change, there's been slight improvements, but this Reconstruction period really is not going to get the success that people initially thought it was going to do. But now we get a fight back with what's known as radical Reconstruction. So we got the president really slowing up, but now we get anti-slave Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner challenging the president, saying that actually no, they've got to be run like territories. So there's problems in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau, which gave plantation land to slaves and helped give them healthcare and education, got no money left. There's nothing left there. So they go on the attack. They twice override the veto by the president. That's the president's ability to try and stop it. And the Congress gets approved the 14th Amendment in 1866, which says that everyone needs to be treated equally and regardless of their race. This is a huge majority in the elections. Had also been gained to back this up. And in 1867, they got the rights for black men in Washington to vote for the first time. Southern states would follow. So if we update our issue on this, we said due to the president that they'd only made a slight improvement. We've now got this with this 14th Amendment. We've now got this taking a step further up towards this way, so that we've now got a further improvement. They also say that there's 3 Reconstruction Acts. Basically, they said this is a nonsense that these southern states have had this power. So they established 5 military districts in the South. Army officers had to ensure black rights were protected. All voters' rights were registered, and the Confederate states had to write their own new constitutions, which allowed black Americans to vote and to agree the 13th and 14th Amendments before they were allowed to give them. So it's taken all that power that those southern states immediately gained straight after Lincoln's death, but it's really reduced it again. Now, major steps forward here. 2,000 black Americans were elected to political posts. The 14th Amendment became law, which overturns the Dred Scott case, which said that the federal government could intervene. And then Andrew Johnson loses the presidential election to the ex-Union General Ulysses S. Grant, and we get the 15th Amendment being accepted, which says that every US citizen has the right to vote to prevent Black Americans, freed Americans being able to vote. So if we draw a line again, we've now, under radical Reconstruction, we've now got a significant stage forward for those believing that the freed slaves should have their rights. And then we get a reverse. Reconstruction loses its way. Many in the South believe that if you give the 15th Amendment, if you give the vote to illiterate African Americans, you're going to lead to ruin because they won't know what they're voting for. Southern states, despite these changes, however, are still dominated by white voters because ex-slaves didn't meet the property qualifications. Many of those leading Republicans we just saw who had led the way die, and the Republicans lose the majority in the 1874 elections. It's the Reconstruction project slowed by 1870. Freeman's Bureau is closed, and sadly, we now get the power coming back to groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League. And what they do is they target black citizens and voters, and slowly they stop any political power that they had. Many black families are little better than slaves now. They're sharecroppers. They live on land owned by the whites, often the former plantation owners. They have to give them 2/3 of their crops each year, which gives them more power. And basically, they're free, but they're little more than slaves. Ulysses Grant, the great hope, the general who had won, promised assistance but didn't do anything because his focus is on the failing economy. Just when you think things can't get any worse, the Supreme Court, the body that's supposed to ensure equality between the two sides and make sure things are balanced, says that although voters are to be treated equally in the national elections, at state elections, that doesn't have to be the case. This opens the door to segregation in the South, separate schools, parks, restaurants. The Supreme Court then says in 1875 that the Constitution means that the government doesn't have the power to intervene if black voters were stopped from voting, which seems difficult to understand. Politics becomes dominated by ex-Confederate officers in the South, and they're elected by white voters, largely because black voters are too scared to vote because of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Soldiers are withdrawn in 1877. The White League and the Ku Klux Klan dominate, and most of the rest of the country now look towards the West. So these gains that have been, we started up here, and now we're seeing, yep, they're not slaves, they're free, but they're not an awful lot better. So the line is just above where we started in my interpretation of this. We do have a situation really where, despite the bloodshed of the American Civil War, very little seems to have been gained.